Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to Tabletops and Taverns, the show where I talk about topics relevant to role-playing gamers. This episode is part of a series covering Dungeons & Dragons style alignments. You can catch my opinions on the alignment system used in D&D and derivative works in general, as well as my take on the 3-alignment version from the original D&D at a link somewhere on this page. I will also put it in the description below. But in this video, at least, I'm going to talk a little bit about the good alignments. Now, for purposes of this video, I'm going to proceed from the idea that you're interested in the whys and hows of playing a good alignment from a role-playing standpoint, not a mechanical standpoint. This will not be about how to optimize a paladin. This is not going to be how to use the smite evil mechanics. This is purely about portraying a good and virtuous character from the standpoint of the characterization of that character. I'll say that like 5 times fast. Anyway, it is, as always, just my opinions, just opinions and observations that I've dug up from as many years as I've been DMing and playing the game, as well as whatever I've been reading. So, just getting that out there. Don't hate me if you disagree. If you disagree, just leave a comment. And I'm always willing to learn from people. Any rate, in the classic 2-axis alignment system, the good alignments, Lawful Good, Neutral Good, and Chaotic Good, are considered the heroic alignments. Most, but not all by any means, most published adventures and published adventure paths generally assume that the majority of player characters are going to be of good alignment. It is basically the default alignment. They may go further and make assumptions that the characters are going to have certain motivations based on that alignment that aren't necessarily the case in every good character, but that's something to talk about another time. As a result of this default state of the good alignments, a lot of players really kind of wrongly consider the good alignments to be boring. And it means that it's kind of rare for players to actively seek out and take an active interest in playing them. Now, by that, I don't mean that players won't play good characters by any means, because quite a few will. It's just, how do you put this? How many times have you heard one of your players, or if you're not a DM, then someone else in your group, whatever group you're in, how many times you've heard them explicitly ask if they can play an evil character or a neutral but may as well be evil kind of character? And I'm just referring to heroic or otherwise good-oriented campaigns. Now, how many times have you heard that? They say, oh, I can play an evil character in this. Give me a chance. Let me try this out. Okay. Now, if you've also played any kind of scoundrelous or villainous kind of campaign, and there are some out there, how many times have you heard someone in one of those campaigns request to play a good character? Now, I understand that there's the villainous types of campaigns are much rarer. They are rarely run. They are rarely produced. However, if you adjust them on kind of a per capita basis, I believe that you'll find what I've found over the years, and that is way more people in a good campaign or a heroic campaign are actively interested in requesting an evil kind of character than the opposite. That is, somebody requesting a good character in an evil campaign. Now, some people may request a particular kind of good character in a good campaign, but it's generally when they want to play something that's a borderline good. In other words, good with loopholes. A good inquisitor who can torture, or some sort of summoner that summons evil demons to bind them. And that is kind of almost like just asking to play straight up evil. Now, I can only speak for myself. I've played several villainous kinds of campaigns, and a lot of times people are perfectly happy to play villains. They don't. I think I've only had one player ever ask to play a good character in a villainous campaign. Whereas in my good campaigns, they're asking every 5 minutes. Now, mind you, I've done the same thing in the past. I'm guilty as well. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, it's just to illustrate a point. Some people may point to this false idea, as I stated before, that playing good is boring. I personally chalk it up to something else. I follow this theory. Playing good isn't boring. It's difficult. It's difficult because functionally, being good consistently is a harder path to take. You give up a lot of easy solutions to some problems. Intentionally taking the high road can potentially cost your character the chances for immediate monetary gain. It can burden a character or a party with prisoners or hangers-on that you've rescued from perilous situations, that sort of thing. It's difficult because in many fantasy realms, the world itself is kind of a dark place. And a good character therefore makes a more brilliant target for people to aim at. But mostly it's difficult. Because while most people in real life assume themselves to be good, when it comes right down to the nitty-gritty of actually doing so in a manner that goes out of their way or inconveniences them or puts them at risk, then it's a slightly different matter. When the rubber meets the road, people often, despite their best intentions, despite their best claims, they'll fail to act. They'll try to leave it to someone else if they absolutely can. This is why when something does happen that requires some sort of action, whether it being endangering oneself to help another, or merely taking time and resources out of your daily grind to make a positive difference in somebody else's life, we can generally single out those that actually pull through with it, actually go through with it, with some sort of praise or note, because of the majority of the people, the vast number of people that say they would do such a thing. It's only a smaller subset of people that actually do it. I mean, I'm not trying to tear into anybody. It's just that the way things are. The way things have always been, and they will always likely be. Generally speaking, everybody, when the situation comes up, everybody will start looking to one another and wait to see somebody else go first. And therefore, they won't take that proactive step. Now, they may still be good, but they're more akin to those people that just write down good on their character sheet and say, meh, I'm good, okay. Anyway, and that comes across in the game. A fair amount of people will look for loopholes or simply kind of back off and, as I said, just write good on their character sheet and be done with it and not worry about it anymore. I mean, we're supposed to, the characters are supposed to be good, do-gooders or not. But handling things on a case-by-case basis can be really hard work. Giving the opponents a chance to surrender could lead to being betrayed, for instance. So it's best to just take no prisoners whatsoever. And maybe it's simpler to just drop a fireball or a cloud kill into that goblin warren, rather than go down there and check to see if there's any innocent prisoners or even goblin civilians that have no interest in fighting. So that's the kind of attitude that it's not the attitude per se, but it's the, oh, well, we could do this, but it would be easier to take the shortcut. And the easier shortcut is usually the non-good option. Anyway, my point is that playing an actively good character is harder than it looks, especially in a game system that sort of rewards indiscriminate killing. A clever DM who wants to reward good players that are actually playing good can do so in more ways than simply tacking an experience bonus onto their awards for playing their alignment. If a player is genuinely sticking to one of the good alignments and playing the various virtues that are associated with that alignment, then as their character becomes more well known, it should be reflected in the game. A character who is honorable and trustworthy, for instance, should have an easier time making deals or negotiating with people who value such qualities. A character who is generous might find their generosity returned later, either by the same people they once helped, or by persons who have merely heard of their actions. A character who has mercy on prisoners and surrendering enemies might find themselves spared by further enemies that take them, that defeat them later on. Or perhaps they find the beings that they once spared coming to help them out later on in an entirely different manner. All of these methods of rewarding a character can have a very real game impact, and yet they're difficult to define in a mechanical system. I know the Pathfinder RPG tries to define things like honor and reputation via an optional in-game mechanic. Other systems have similar systems, but such things can kind of feel a bit contrived at times. If your DM is any sort of decent at the game, then it shouldn't be that difficult for them to adapt. And to be honest, successfully playing your alignment is one of those things, one of those close places in role-playing, where the actual role-playing can almost touch the mechanics of the game, and yet be better off not doing so. Simply giving the Dungeon Master kind of guidelines, rather than hard and fast rules in such a thing. The guidelines would no doubt work better most of the time. Anyway, we've talked about why it's hard to be a good aligned character. How characters might find being good rewarding in game. I mean, besides the skill that it can take just to portray the character. But I haven't touched on the actually playing a good character. And that's kind of with a reason. I've been putting it off. Because there are as many ways to play a good character as there are definitions of goodness. However, that being said, there's a difference between playing a proactively good character that goes out of their way to represent their ideals and virtues, one that merely kind of sticks back and holds to those virtues without stepping forth and actually, performing deeds based on them, and then those that just kind of scribble good in the alignment section of their sheet and are done with it. Furthermore, each of the 3 good alignments represents an entirely different facet of good. There's some overlap, of course, but generally speaking, they approach good in different ways. Even with the same player, that same player that may have the same outlook of what good is and good isn't, that player has a real strong sense of how to portray good in the game already. That same player can play 2 different characters of entirely different good alignments and still end up playing those characters differently simply because of the alignment and the facet of good that they represent. So it does end up being a little bit more complex. Goodness, aside from some very, very objectively good and objectively evil acts, like flagrantly murdering an entire population for no reason, is probably an evil act. Aside from those extremes, a lot of the whole good versus evil thing can kind of fade into a gray area on a lot of cases, even in a game as black and white in a lot of instances as D&D. But basically, out of all of the ideals of good, let's talk about some that are commonly identified virtues and qualities of the 3 main good alignments. And we'll talk about some examples and some ways to work them into your game. Now, let's start with the big one. And that's the one that so many people seem to dislike, and I believe it's mostly because of its association with paladins. Lawful Good. Lawful Good is the alignment of your typical white knight. It has several subsets that aren't, white knighty or crusadey. There is, of course, the Crusader that carries on the fight to the forces of evil. Then there's the Guardians who stay about the civilized lands and protect them from the dark hordes and the encroaching chaos. There's the duty-bound Lord who builds pillars of civilization out of the uncharted wild. And it covers a lot of ground. I mean, this alignment represents order, discipline, and control, but tempered with the positive principles of goodness. The archetypical paladin, of course, would be representative of this alignment, but also the kind and benevolent king who works to improve his people's lots in life. The dutiful guard who sees herself as the protector of all the innocents under her ward, or even the hard-working peasant who gladly supports his neighbors in their time of need and shares his meager meal willingly with a traveler down on their luck. All of those are aspects of lawful good. Some of the virtues one would associate with lawful goodness are honor, valor, honesty, and justice. And I'm sure there are many, many, many others out there. You could go on naming them for hours, but let's just take a look at these just as some examples. Generally, these are all things that follow a certain code of conduct or that rely on self-discipline. Honor is kind of a bit of both. It basically means following a recognizable code of conduct that holds oneself to a higher standard than one would normally expect. Valor often goes hand in hand with honor, but mostly applies to combat, specifically not showing cowardice in the face of difficulty, never hesitating to face a foe that's done evil, or running in and putting oneself in danger ahead of one's companions, that sort of thing. Honesty is pretty much what it says on the tin, being honest and truthful in one's words, also in one's actions. And this does mean that you don't intentionally mislead without lying, because you can mislead by virtue of omittance, for instance. Justice tempers the laws necessary for civilization with an even hand, so you don't mete out punishments where they're undeserved. You moderate what punishments that are placed out there if they're excessive. You do everything you can to ascertain that those who have been convicted of a crime are genuinely guilty before administering the punishment. Justice might always involve ensuring that victims receive assistance. Victims of bad things may receive assistance just to set it right, rather than looking for a wrongdoer. If an accident happens to somebody, then that person may need help up. A just individual would say, "Oh, that's not fair. We'll try and give them some help." Lawful good is often considered the least nuanced of all the three main good alignments, and that is not really true. I would say that it's not lawful stupid. It's not lawful asshole. It is lawful good. The goodness has to be present. A player who plays their lawful good person is somebody that just goes around smiting every evildoer they see just because they're evil. That's not lawful good. That's just a selective murderer. There should be a reason that a lawful good character performs those actions, and those actions should always be motivated by things like protecting the innocents, especially ones that are actively threatened, bringing justice to an offender that has already acted and they have a reason for you to act against them, something along those lines. Or at the very least, the character's actions should be tempered by the idea that you're working to improve the world and your society, not just because somebody might cause trouble at a later date, but also it's important for a lawful good character to build society up. At least as important to build society up as it is to take down evildoers. Just think about that for a moment, because they are promoting civilization either way. But without building up that civilization first, without building up that order, that cohesive organization, then there's nothing to protect. I'd say that of the three good alignments, playing lawful good realistically and not as some caricature of an alignment is probably the hardest of the three. But that's just my opinion. Now, if lawful good has your crusaders and your kings, then neutral good is the middle ground. Neutral good is goodness simply for the sake of goodness. It's untempered by the concerns of law, and yet not actively seeking to disrupt any particular order. A neutral good character is a good fit for a nurturing healer, a wandering prophet or preacher, a mediator who basically tries to negotiate peaceful resolutions, or, if they're in a more militant role, even an inquisitor who goes beyond the law on occasion to root out sources of evil, at the very source. Neutral good is not actually a particularly complex alignment. It is, in fact, the simplest of the good alignments, simply because it's the one that doesn't have any specific, interactions with the other axis. It's also potentially the most flexible of them. It's got a wider range than the rest of them. A sampling of the virtues that you might associate with neutral goodness are wisdom and temperance, pacifism, and mercy. Wisdom, of course, not referring to the ability score, but rather to taking consideration of your actions' consequences, thinking of the possible outcomes so you may pick the one that either causes the least harm or does the most good. Temperance goes hand in hand with that, and is simply the act of moderating one's own actions so as to cause less harm to others or to oneself. Pacifism might be full-on pacifism in the face of all violence, or more simply, more often, just looking at violence not as the first solution, trying to negotiate and use logic and reason first, and then acting in violence later. Now, of course, if you're getting jumped in the middle of a battle, then yeah, defending yourself is all right. But if you have a chance to confront your opponent and reason it out, that might be the better option a lot of times. After all, if one can talk to one's foes reasonably and convince them to lay down their arms, not only have you avoided potential bloodshed, but you might potentially convert them to your own cause of goodness. Or at the very least, you can bring them to bringing them to proper justice rather than just murdering them in a field somewhere. Mercy is similar. Not every fight need to be to the death. Non-combatants need not be slain out of hand. If you are walking through tunnels and you find some civilian, as I said before, civilian goblins, that's the typical idea of the orc babies sitting there, then you don't need to kill them in order to remain good. In fact, you probably shouldn't. But it extends to other things. How many times have your characters gotten a bar brawl and instantly everybody reached for their swords? What would happen if you did that in real life? You swing a few punches, you might get assault. You pull out a gun and shoot someone, you're going in for, at the very least, manslaughter, most likely murder. So, mercy, at the very least, helps, de-escalate all of that. The guiding factor behind a lot of these virtues, you'll notice, is a respect for life in all of its forms. And that kind of stretches in through the entire, positive experience of being good. Interestingly enough, almost every aspect of the virtues you might associate with neutral good can be associated with any good character of any of the three alignments to a greater or lesser degree. And that is because goodness, or neutral goodness, being goodness without the tint of law or chaos behind it, can easily diffuse itself into the other two alignments. So we've got lawful good and neutral good out of the way. This just leaves chaotic good. Chaotic good characters are the righteous rebels, the freedom lovers. Elves in the older edition were classically chaotic good. They rejected the strictures of civilization to embrace the wild, but weren't destructive about it. There's the freedom fighter that works to overthrow an evil warlord, but takes great pains not to kill any innocents. There's the ranger who, like the elves, prefers to be close to the wilderness, but does so to actively hunt the evil that lies within it, or to protect the innocents that may dwell past the protective walls of civilization. Basically, the representative in stone of the limits of order and law. Chaotic good values the individual over the collective, but does so with the respect of all individuals, recognizing that you can't just grant individual freedom to one person. It must be equally distributed to everybody. Virtues associated with chaotic good mostly veer towards those supporting the individual. Again, freedom, of course, is prime, but there's also enlightenment and joy. Freedom is, again, exactly what it sounds like. The ability to live without the restrictions of others imposed upon you. To prosper or fail by your own hand, pretty much. But also the recognition that others deserve the exact same treatment, that you should not impose your ways upon others by force. Persuasion, perhaps, but not by means of violence. Of course, if they try to either resist you or impose their own will upon you by force of arms, and you're free. Self-defense is fair game. Enlightenment could be important to any alignment on any part of the spectrum, but to the chaotic good, it represents a certain freedom from the dogma that might be fed to the individual by organizations, even with the best of intentions. People under the idea of enlightenment are encouraged to think for themselves, deciding whether something is good or not on their own terms and with their own experiences. Joy implies some sort of love of life, seeing the best in the world and finding happiness in those simple experiences, living for the moment perhaps, allowing others to discover what makes them happy on their own terms without interference. In my experience, chaotic good characters are almost as hard to play as lawful good ones, but for different reasons. I've lost count of the number of times people have used chaotic good just to play chaotic neutral in an otherwise good party. It's really, really strange sometimes. As with all of the good alignments, a chaotic good character's actions should be tempered with, good. And that means sometimes refraining from being a jackass just for the sake of being a jackass. If a lawful good character presents a plan that actually has merit and perhaps would save people's lives and doesn't impose authority on anybody's liberty, then if the chaotic good character gets up in the paladin's face, for instance, and refuses to go along with such a plan just because it was proposed by the man, well, that's chaotic. But it's not very good. It's being argumentative for argumentative's sake. Anyway, that's just a scattering of ideas on each of the three alignments. There are many, many more out there because basically most of human history in the real world has been rife with people trying to decide different ways of doing good for others. So you could literally go over the entire history of humanity and find examples here and examples there of how to portray goodness. For now, we're just going to go ahead and leave the examples that I've set as is. But if you have any particular input that you feel really merits mentioning, leave a comment in the section below. I love to hear them. I love to read them. I always learn from everything anybody tells me. May not agree with it, but at least I consider it, and who knows, it may provide a different viewpoint that I hadn't thought about. But for now, let's talk about another aspect of good alignments, one that's not really commented on a lot, and that is intra-good conflict. And it's an interesting topic, and I'm not going to go real deep into it, but suffice to say that as surely as evil alignments are constantly at each other's throats, good alignments certainly have their own problems with working with one another. A shared alignment may make the conflicts less vitriolic, but they can still be impressive nonetheless. The most obvious conflict is between lawful good and chaotic good, with the rebels disliking the sort of control and dogma that the Crusaders might be putting into place, for instance. But even within the individual alignments themselves, some conflict can take place, and it can be bloody at times. Take, for instance, two lawful good nations in the same area with different conflicting religions, or even with interests in the same rare and critical resource. Their shared alignment may make it more likely that it will eventually negotiate a peaceful solution to it all, but it's entirely possible that a state of war may break out. This may be a highly structured affair with little bloodshed, but major armies just kind of maneuvering against one another for the upper hand, with very few battles. It may be wandering knights formally dueling each other in the countryside, or it even could be a war in name only, with most of the action taking place in the court of the nobles, with scheming and with negotiations, and sometimes with the point of a blade. Perhaps two fiercely independent, chaotic good clans are set to blows over an accident occurring at a county fair. Perhaps one clan lord hit on another clan lord's wife without knowing she was that, and then ever since there's been this major feud between them and has resulted in bloodshed. Maybe they compete against one another in a sport or something, and then it just spills over into armed conflict. They've got so involved with it. The point being is that just because two groups share the same alignment doesn't mean that they will be at peace, even for the good guys. Some of the most interesting dynamics are when a party gets involved in such a conflict, looks for the bad guy in the situation, only to find that both sides may have valid points. They may both be acting honorably and mercifully, and yet they still can't get along. Picking a side between good and evil is easy, but having your players pick a side between good and the other good can be infuriating and actually kind of fun to watch. But I hope that this little talk has given you some food for thought, at least when you're playing good characters, either as a PC or, if you're a DM, as an NPC. I don't claim to be an absolute authority on such things, but at least it's a start, hopefully. Remember, too, just because you're playing good doesn't mean that you have to go full-on, full-bore good all the time. Only if you're trying to play like a paladin or a saint or something similar would that matter. If you're simply a good fighter or a good tradesman, you can have vices on the side, you can fail to act sometimes, and it can be an interesting interaction between those who are reasonably good when they can be, when they can afford to be, and those who really, really want to bury that alignment needle all the way up in there. And they may not always agree, even if in principle they should. Some good references, especially if you're playing one of the compatible systems, are the Book of Exalted Deeds for D&D 3.5 and the Champions of Purity accessory for Pathfinder. Both have been out for a while, the Book of Exalted Deeds especially for a very long while, but both have interesting and thoughtful sections on approaching good characters, as well as a lot of crunch if you're playing the system, the actual system involved. Especially if your DM allows their use. Not a lot of DMs allow every single thing from these things. I will put links to where you can purchase these in the description below. Purchase them if you want. I don't know. They're not really available for free, but if you want to add to them, I know I own the Book of Exalted Deeds back here. If you want to add it to your collection, you can get them on Amazon still. You can get them on DriveThru, I don't think you can get them on DriveThru. Yeah, you can get the Book of Exalted Deeds on DriveThru RPG somewhere. Anyway, I'll put the links in the description below. If you can suggest any other decent RPG books about playing good, please leave me a comment. I'd love to see what else is out there. I would love to go ahead and read everything I can about it, just because the more I learn, the better I can run NPCs for my people that involve those alignments. Anyway, for now, this has been the RPG Crawler. If you like what you've seen, remember to like. As I said before, if you've got any input, any feedback, leave a comment below, and subscribe for more RPG content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.